All right, hello everyone, both in person and online. Welcome to the Caregiving and Work webinar and event that we're hosting with Nora Spinks. So my name is Tanya, and I'll be moderating the webinar as well as the Q&A session both online and in person. I'm the project manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability. And this webinar and event is made possible through community grants program through the BC government, as well as through donations and memberships to our organization. Today we have our speaker, Nora Spinks. She's a renowned speaker, consultant, and award-winning thought leader. She spent more than 25 years working with business, labor, government, and community leaders across Canada and abroad to strengthen families, create productive and supportive work environments, and build healthy communities. Nora has developed, implemented, and evaluated a variety of programs that focus on employee health and well-being, family care, workplace flexibility, and work-life harmony. And since 2011, in her role as CEO of the Vanier Institute of Family, Nora has engaged the research community to mobilize knowledge and connect those who study, serve, and support Canada's diverse families. She has also been on the board of CIRPD for the past 2 years, and we're very glad to have her here with us today.
Thank you, Tanya, for that wonderful and warm introduction. So we have about an hour together. I'm going to share with you what we now know about caregiving and work, what's happening, what's working. Please feel free to jump in, add your thoughts, ask questions. We'll also have time towards the end to also answer questions. So just modifying the location of some microphones here. If you're having any difficulty, please send us a message. So I want to begin by framing our conversation today. And really what we're talking about is we are all now living longer. Our life expectancy at birth is early 80s, but if we calculate our life expectancy at 65, we can expect to live another 30 years on top of that. So if you get through your adolescence and you get through young adulthood and you reach 65, chances are you're going to live closer to 90. So what that means is we're all building mind, body, spirits to live to be 100. And there's two sides to that coin. One is we need to make sure that our own personal health span and lifespan are in sync. So we want to take care of our own health, our own stress, our own well-being. But also the second, which we're going to be focusing on today, is the likelihood is that when you are in the paid labor force, either you or somebody you are working with or working for are going to be dealing with a caregiving situation. So at any given time, one of your team members will be dealing with caring for another adult. Now, we're not going to talk today about caring for children or caring for children with disabilities. We'll touch on that when it comes to dual responsibilities or multiple responsibilities. But when we talk about caregiving and work, we're talking about caring for another adult. Now, you're going to hear different kind of language. There's an emerging language set around caregivers, and we've been sort of talking about the family friend caregiver for a while now, but the people who get paid to provide care refer to themselves as caregivers. So the new and emerging language around family or friend care is a carer. So we used to have in this country a group called the Canadian Caregivers Coalition. Well, now they're called Carers Canada. And the reason for that is to distinguish between those providing care, unpaid, but critically part of the team, and caregivers that may be professionals, paraprofessionals, or paid people who are delivering care at home or in a community setting. So I'm going to use the term carer and caregiver sort of intermixed in our time together this morning. But when I use the term caregiver, I'm referring to a family or friend who is providing care, support, assistance that is unpaid and in many cases unrecognized. Now, when we talk about care receiver or the person receiving care, we tend to assume and jump to a conclusion that that means an elder family member, which is true. We do provide care to seniors, to elders, to parents, to grandparents. But what we're also seeing is an increase in the number of people who are providing care for a disabled sibling. And in part, that's because baby boomers are turning 65 at a rate of 1 every 7 seconds in North America. So every 7 seconds, another boomer turns 65. And they're the first generation that if they had a sibling with a disability, either that they were born with or that they acquired over their lifetime, that those family members with disabilities are now living well into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this is the first generation where siblings are picking up that role and responsibility as their parents are either aging in their 80s and 90s or after they've passed away. So that's a whole new group that gets under-recognized or under-reported. We're also need to clarify that when we're talking about carers, people who are supporting a family member, they're not always just adults providing care to a senior. Increasingly, it's a spouse. So parents, grandparents, siblings, but also spouses. And again, because a lot of our health conditions are coming down in age. So it used to be that if you were going to get Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or osteoarthritis, you wouldn't start to see those symptoms until you were well into your 60s or 70s or even later. Well, now we're seeing onset into their 50s and into their 40s. And so as the age drops down, the increase in demand for family carers. The other thing that we know about family carers is that as soon as you figure out how to manage your multiple responsibilities at home and at work, something's going to change. Your kids are going to become adolescents, or you're going to have another baby, or your father dies and mother needs help, or mother who is a primary caregiver of father becomes ill, and now there becomes this more complex situation. So it's not static. So once we've sort of figured out how things are going and everything's finally going smoothly, you get a promotion at work or you get a new responsibility or something happens at home. So when we talk about family carers, it's a moving target. It's not a thing or a set of circumstances, but rather it's continuously changing. We also know that there is incredible diversity with respect to the way in which families and family members engage in care and caregiving. Some cultures, it's an expectation, it's a cultural duty. In others, it's more optional from a social or cultural perspective. And for others, it's just a matter of circumstances and it's an obligation. So you happen to be the child of an elder who lives in close proximity. So you're going to be the one who takes on that responsibility. We also know that as we move forward in time, the complexity of caregiving is increasing because of family mobility. So it used to be that the family was close at hand geographically, and so there were 4 or 5 siblings, and each one could take a day or a role or take on a responsibility and sort of spread the load. And in the previous generation, it was 4 or 5 individuals caring for one person. Now we're seeing one person caring for 4 or 5 adults and seniors. And so we've completely flipped the demand pyramid here. And as that gets more complicated and as there are fewer carers, there's also elements of gender that get in the way. It used to be that when we talked about care and carers, women were playing a particular role when it came to caregiving and men a different role. Well, now if you've only got 1 or 2 siblings and they're both males, then we no longer have the option to divide roles and responsibilities by gender. We're going to talk about care receivers as well as caregivers when we're talking about caregiving and work, and it's important to understand sort of the context. So I'm going to give you some numbers. Don't worry about writing any of this down. You can get it from the Vancouver Sun's op-ed that was published yesterday. There's also a ton of stuff on the VanneyInstitute.ca website. A lot of this data comes from Statistics Canada. It also comes from a project that we had the opportunity to work on with the University of Alberta, the University of Guelph, and the University of Quebec and Montreal, where we actually went out and interviewed and surveyed people, both employed caregivers and employers, and looked at sort of the issue of caregiving and work from both perspectives. But I want to just spend a couple of minutes just setting the context. So we are talking about Canadians who are aging. We are talking about people who are living significantly longer. So we have seen a 76+% increase since 2003. We're looking forward to the StatsCan release of the census data from 2016, which we expect to have in our hands by February, and we'll be able to update these numbers. But the forecast is that between now and 2031, we're going to see almost a 200% increase in those living over 100. What's also interesting about this population is typically those who were over 100 were almost all women. And now the men are sort of fulfilling their role as centenarians, and they're more male centenarians than ever before. And so we're not quite sure how their needs are different than centenarian women, but there is sort of that opportunity now for us to understand that. Health is and will continue to be a bigger and bigger priority for everybody as we're living longer, as we're taking on more responsibility, as our healthcare system becomes more acutely, where the demands are more acute, and it will be harder to find family physicians, it will be harder to find services in the community. We're going to have to take more responsibility for our own health and well-being, and our own, take more responsibility for our own wellness. So with that in mind, we also recognize that each generation is playing a role in this. Boomers turning 65 at a rate of 1 every 7 seconds. The oldest band of boomers are turning 70 in 2017, and they're, like they've done ever since they were born, changing everything that they touch along the life course. So when they were born, before the baby boomers came along, babies were just born. By the time the boomers happened, it became customary to have babies born in hospitals with obstetricians and gynecologists, and then they became 4 and 5, and we invested heavily in kindergartens, and then when they came out of high school, we invested heavily in colleges and universities, and when they were in their early 20s, we got all the attention focused on aerobics, and now the attention is on yoga and golf and gardening. And so they continue to have an impact. By the time the boomers turned 55, we began talking about mandatory retirement, and mandatory retirement disappeared, and started to redefine aging and redefine career trajectories. And this is as a result of the baby boom population. Now they're starting to turn 70, they're continuing to redefine aging and redefining work in old age. And so instead of when baby boomers were born, back 65, 70 years ago, life expectancy for men was only 68, and now it's closer to 90. And so in their lifetime, we have seen a massive change, and yet we haven't seen the same kind of significant change in our public policies or public institutions to keep up with that phenomenon. So we still have people who tend to retire in their early to mid to late 60s now, with the expectation or the savings or the community supports with the expectation that retirement is 5 or 6 years, when in fact it's 25 or 26 years. And so boomers are redefining aging, but some of our social supports haven't caught up. Having said that, boomers are redefining some of the roles and responsibilities. So when we think about aging and seniors and elders, we tend to think of them as the gray tsunami that's going to overwhelm the healthcare system, and the demands are going to be so great, when in fact it's not going to happen like a tsunami, it's going to happen more like drip. And it's going to be a steady drip, but it's going to be a drip. And in the meantime, seniors and elders are going to continue to play a very significant role in our families, in our households, in our communities, and in our workplaces. And so we need to keep that in mind, that seniors and elders, and we define seniors from 65 to 85 and elders above 85. And in some places, if you've had the opportunity to experience seniors discounts, you can go into places like your local pharmacy and get seniors discount at the age of 55. We sort of are moving that up to 65 and counting seniors as 65 to 85 and elders 85 plus. And that 85 plus is a whole new set of language that we need to recognize, because their needs are quite different in some ways than those who are in their 70s and 80s. We also have the next generation coming into the workplace, and this is about caregiving and work. And if work is being redefined by the incoming generations, the millennials and the Gen X's coming in, then we need to recognize that as part of the caregiving and work conversation. So if the new generations coming in, those in their 20s and in their 30s, they have a different relationship with their parents, they have a different relationship with employment, they have a different relationship with the way in which income is generated, they have a different definition of work and family. And we used to talk about work-family balance. The younger generations come in and they've completely rejected the language, because for them there's life of which work is part. It's not about side A and side B where you have to balance between the two, but that life is life and work is simply a part of life. And so it's changing the conversations within the workplace, because we used to talk about work and family and work supports and work arrangements, and now they're talking about redefining or redescribing the interface between employer and employee and work and working and life and non-work side of life and everything else. The other piece is part of the context is that many people are living much longer with more complex health conditions, more disabilities, and those folks are also in the paid labor force. And increasingly, although it's still the highest rates of unemployment are within this population, but when we talk about complex health conditions, we're talking about things that are either progressive, so something like an MS or dementia that's more long-term. We're also talking about episodic health conditions. We're also talking about disabilities that either come from birth or acquired in either adolescence or childhood or adulthood. Now, I want to just sort of give you a picture of what this means in terms of volume of attention, because right now the challenge with getting attention around caregiving and work is that if you are a caregiver, you are working really hard and you don't have time to go to meetings and seminars, and if you've got time to search the web, it's at 3 o'clock in the morning after you've just got up and you've provided care to somebody. What we need to know is, and we need to plan and anticipate when we are going to be both the care provider, if we're not already, and or the care receiver anyway. So I just want to give you a couple of visuals that show you how dramatically our population has changed and why caregiving and work is a conversation that is a hot topic today and will continue to become part of our everyday experiences going forward. So if you look at those elders today, the elders over the age of 85, when they were born, Canada had an agricultural economy, families were single source income, and the population pyramid looked actually like a pyramid. So we have males on one side, females on the other, and pay attention to the peaks and the dips. And for me, the dips are more important actually than the peaks, because the peaks get all the attention and the dips get ignored. But it's the dips that are going to cause us the most stress and strain when it comes to caregiving and work. So you can see at the top end, very few people lived beyond 63, 64, 68, and then lots of kids below to provide the care necessary. And then we get before the Second World War, and post-war there's that dip. So between the First and Second World War, there's fewer babies born, fertility drops, and then we start to see fertility coming out as the war is ending. And that produces the baby boom. And now we have this massive cohort that is available to provide the care, but also if you look at the top of the pyramid, the top is also getting much more full and fulsome. We then fast forward to 2011, and those baby boomers are pushing into 65 and into 70, and you can also see at the top of the pyramid it's going further, but it's no longer a pyramid. It's now more like what we refer to as the Christmas tree. So it's peak at the top, it's a lot of support in the middle, and then that support starts to diminish as we go down the age spectrum. We expect with the 2016 data and as the projections go forward that we're going to go from the population pyramid to this Christmas tree to a popsicle or a lollipop. And there'll be this bulk at the top and then this skinny group down at the bottom holding everything together. So whether we like it or not, circumstantially, there will be fewer people to provide the care for the many at the top. But it doesn't mean it's going to happen automatically. The other thing to recognize is that when we tend to talk about caregivers and work, we tend to assume mid-career, late career. We tend to assume that people are providing care as senior adults to elder adults, when in fact we're now seeing the younger generation. So see that first dip is Gen X, and then Gen Y or the millennials are that next bulge, and then this Gen I is this next dip. And Gen I is the generation that are the offspring of Gen X. So wherever there's a dip, there's likely going to be another dip. So the peak is really peak to peak, and it's just raw biology. I have 2 kids, you have 2 kids, and it happens. But what's interesting to recognize here is that those in this dip down at the bottom, they have long-standing, healthy relationships with their grandparents and their great-grandparents. So this is the first generation where many of them are born with great-grandparents and have those great-grandparents in their lives well into their teens, and some of them even into their 20s. And so, and if they don't have that kind of relationship with a great-grandparent, they have grandparents at their weddings. They have grandparents involved in their lives right through and into adulthood. And in some cases, we're seeing skip generations. So the parents aren't there at all, but the grandparents are. And so when we talk about carers, we need to recognize that you can be a carer at any time. And we now have data. StatsCan used to only collect data for carers with a population in the survey over the age of 45. So all of our historic data is 45 and up. And it's only very recently in the most recent general social survey that they actually started asking people 15 and up what kind of care they're providing. And that gives us the first glimpse at good solid data on the 15 to 45-year-olds providing care. But in talking to those 15 to 24-year-olds, what we refer to as young carers asked, how old were you when you started to provide care, or how many years have you been providing care? Many of them started providing care as young as age 10 or even lower. We're not quite sure what that is. And increasingly with the availability of technology, young carers are becoming more invisible. In the past, if you were 12, 13 years old and you were caring for mom with a mental illness, or you were caring for dad with a degenerative health condition, the community would find out. The bills didn't get paid, things didn't happen. Now you can be 10 years old and be managing household finances and nobody would be the wiser. nobody would know. Bills get paid, funds come in, things get purchased, and they can remain invisible for a lot longer. We do know that some of the young carers, the largest cohort of young carers, are caring for single mothers who have mental illness. And so we often get that population forgotten. Critically important because providing care at any age has costs and consequences. And if you're late career, it might mean that you have to leave work a little bit earlier, retire earlier than you expected, or earlier than your savings are able to support you. But if you're a young carer, it may impact your ability to complete high school, to go into post-secondary, to become attached to the labor force at all. It may impact your ability to get part-time jobs or volunteer or get that sort of basic experience outside of caregiving. But caregiving is a normal experience. And right now, caregiving is a part of life. It's part of living from coast to coast to coast in this country. When we look at care and caregiving and care receiving, we also need to recognize that it's not a straightforward bidirectional relationship. There are often multiple generations involved and you might be both a caregiver and a care receiver. And you may be somebody who's receiving care, but you're also there at home when the school-age kids come home after school because mom's off at work. Not long ago, I was facilitating a roundtable here in British Columbia, and we had a panel that was talking about what's often referred to as the sandwich generation, where a family is responsible for caring for an adult and caring for children simultaneously. And this concept of sandwich generation, although I'm not a fan of the term or the terminology, it does give people a sense of perspective. So somebody put their hand up and said, well, I'm looking after my kids, I'm looking after my mother, but I also have a disabled sibling I'm looking after, and my spouse's ex, who's I'm looking after. What kind of family am I? And so one of the panelists said, oh, you're a triple-decker sandwich. And then somebody put their hand up and said, well, I'm now on disability. I'm looking after my teenage daughter and her baby. I'm looking after my mother and my grandmother. I'm looking after my spouse who's got Alzheimer's, and my sister who has Parkinson's. What kind of sandwich am I? And one of the panelists leans into the microphone and says, ma'am, what you have there is a hero sandwich. And when we look at the complexity of people's lives, we need to recognize that there is these multiple relationships. And as we know, those relationships have history. Unlike when you're a parent and you decide to have a child, or you decide to raise a child either on your own or with another adult, your siblings are your longest standing relationships. And you don't choose those. You acquire those, and you have history, and you have relationships, and you have stuff that you bring into this role as a family caregiver. We can't underestimate the complexity of some of that history when we're talking about family carers. Now, I mentioned earlier that historically men and women have both provided care, and historically the roles have differed. So when we talk about caregiving and work, if you have women who are caregivers in the paid labor force, they have a different set of challenges because often they're the ones who are providing the physical care. So they're the ones that have to make sure that somebody gets up in the morning, has their shower, has their breakfast, gets settled for the day, and then they can go off to work. But you can't say to mom or dad, okay, let's schedule your getting up time, your shower, your breakfast for tomorrow after 8. Whereas men historically have played a role that they are able to defer or control their scheduling a little bit differently. So they were able to say, okay, well, the yard needs to be done, errands need to be run, the finances need to be managed, and they could do that after hours, after work, schedule it with a little bit more ease. Now with the shrinking family size, the gender sort of alignment of those kinds of responsibilities are shifting considerably. So we need to recognize that now we're talking about men and women, we're talking about young early career all the way up to older career. We're talking about low income, middle income, and high income. I had a call a while back from a CEO. He had been interested in caregiving and work, high income, mid to late career, very connected, well-resourced, and he calls me and he says, Nora, I need your help. Okay, how can I help you? I got a call from the hospital this morning. My mom was discharged. I brought her home. Okay, how can I help you? She needs to go to the bathroom. Okay, what do I do? And I said, well, you have a choice. You can deal with it now or you can deal with it later, but you're going to have to deal with it. And he said, well, I've never even seen my mother in her underwear. How do I possibly take her to the toilet? And so I coached him along on how to do that with dignity and with respect, and we got through that immediate crisis. And he said, okay, how do I buy supports for, I got the money, I can do this, who can I call to come in and be with her today? Well, it doesn't matter how much money you have if there are no services to buy, or if the wait period is months, or in some cases years if you're looking at services. You need to plan ahead. And it doesn't matter if you have no money or you have a lot of money. If there is nothing to buy, there is nothing to buy. So it sort of is an equalizer across socioeconomic groups. We know now here in British Columbia, you can be in a care facility that can cost anywhere up to $5,000 to $7,000 a month. Well, if you're lower middle income, and even if you've got some assets set aside and you've sold that $1 million piece of property in suburbia, it doesn't go very far when you're paying $7,000 a month. So there are things to consider. So in terms of caregiving and work,
Code white for red level 1 emergency acute 2. Code white for red level 1 emergency acute 2.
That's the reality of doing webinars in a hospital setting. Every now and again we might get those kinds of interruptions. So for those of you on the line, you're not hearing things, I apologize for the interruption. So caregiving and work, we have right now about 8 million caregivers, and about 6 million of those are in the paid labor force when they become caregivers, which represents at any given time anywhere around 35% plus of the workforce has caregiving responsibilities. So we're not talking about a small group. This is a very large portion of our population. We also know that of those who are caregivers, that about 25% of them spend more than 30 hours providing that kind of care. And again, the more hours you provide, the likelihood is the less flexibility you have around how, where, and when that care happens. So we're talking about high volume, we're talking about high density, we're talking about high duration, we're talking about caregiving and work in a big way. So there are costs and consequences associated with caregiving, and some of the most interesting research around costs and consequences are coming out of University of Alberta, and Dr. Janet Fast and her team and her colleagues are looking at this, and some of the costs are out of pocket. So purchasing those kinds of services, whether it's paying for the taxi to get mom to the hospital, or whether it's taking time off, or whether it's paying for home repairs or renovations so that mom or dad can stay living at home, or adjusting or adapting your own home so that somebody with a disability or an illness can join in or can live with you. So when we talk about costs or consequences, there are direct costs and then there are indirect costs. And the direct costs are usually fairly easy to calculate. The indirect costs are a little bit harder. And we know that some of the costs include health and well-being of the caregiver. So that may be that they're stressed and strained to such an extent of trying to maintain their health or their attachment to the labor force, to keep their jobs, to keep their career path happening. And they may either stall that or they may have to leave the paid labor force completely if the necessary supports aren't there for them to fulfill their multiple obligations, commitments, and responsibilities. The out-of-pocket costs can increase depending on the duration or the type of care that you're providing. Even something as simple as paying for parking when you're providing or managing care when somebody's in hospital can become a financial burden. So we need to keep that in mind. So for some, it's that they have to maintain their attachment to the labor force because that's how they offset the costs, the out-of-pocket costs or the costs of caregiving. I was talking to a woman, she was a caregiver. Her husband had a heart condition. He was in and out of hospital, he was in and out of care, and finally he was in for yet another heart operation, and this time it was a quadruple bypass, and she informed her manager that this operation was happening, and the manager said, well, you've been absent a lot, you've been distracted a lot, you've been unreliable, if you take another day off work, you're fired. Well, this was the only family source of income. This was where the benefits were coming from. This is what made it possible for them to pay for the treatment and the pharmaceuticals and stuff that this family member required. So she said, okay, well, I can't afford to lose my job, so he's going to go have his quadruple bypass, and I'm going to go to work. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, the surgery begins, and at 6 minutes after 11, on the job in her role in a manufacturing facility, she's distracted and has a catastrophic incident in the workplace. She becomes injured. The line goes down. The facility is shut. At every time there's a minute, there's another $100,000 to $200,000 loss in income for the company. The line had to be shut down for several hours because the ambulance had to come and take her out for her own care. Now her kids are now providing care for both mom and dad. The employer has had significant costs. The employee becomes injured and disabled herself, all but for having a morning to go spend at the hospital to be with husband during surgery. So the costs and consequences can be direct, they can be indirect, but we need to be respectful of the reality of being a family carer. So what do family carers need, want, and benefit from in the workplace? It all depends on the job, it depends on their life, and it depends on how, where, and when they want to manage their multiple responsibilities at home, work, and in the community. So some need or want to have it completely separate. So don't ask me about the care I'm providing at work, and when I'm at work or when I'm at home providing care, don't send me emails. And some people really need or want that complete, clean separation. Others want to integrate work and family, so they want some flexibility, some autonomy, they want to be able to work part-time, they want to be able to come back, and they want to be able to integrate work and caregiving demands. Others want to completely blend it. So when I'm on the job, I might be texting my caregiver who's coming into the home to provide care for my loved one, and then I'm in a meeting and I'll take a call, but it's completely blended and there is no separation or integration or overlap between work and life. It just is. So with that in mind, what we want to know is what are the leading and promising practices in the workplace and what's working well for employees that have these multiple responsibilities. So the first thing to think about is what do employees, working caregivers, want from their employers to best be able to fulfill their multiple responsibilities? And the answer comes back consistently year over year, decade over decade. They want recognition and respect that they have a life outside of work, that sometimes that life outside of work includes obligations, commitments, and responsibilities for caregiving for another adult, that it's complex, that it's not always predictable, that you can't always plan for it, but that it's real, and sometimes that attention that requires is a priority, and it doesn't mean that you're any less committed to the workplace, the team, the clients, the customers, but just recognition and respect, first and foremost. Low cost, no cost for an employer of any size, small, medium, large, global organization. Recognition and respect is what employees want. When we ask them, what do you need from your employer in order to fulfill your multiple responsibilities at home, work, and the community? Need is a different way of looking at it, and what they need is flexibility and autonomy. And flexibility and autonomy around how, where, and when work gets done. So can you shift hours? Can you shift time? Can you shift load? Can you compress your work week? Can you extend your work week? Can you modify your work day so you come in a little later and stay a little later, or in reverse, come a little earlier, leave a little earlier, or split your day so that you can go home and do lunch duty and do showering midday and then come back and put in your afternoon shift? What kind of flexibility is there for leaves or breaks, or to shift from a full-time or a full workload, 100% workload, to a partial workload, say a 50% workload, or what we refer to as part-time in most cases? But more importantly, not just the flexibility, but the autonomy around what kind of work gets done when and where. And so you can have all the flexibility you want, but if it's managerial discretion and you have to fill out a form and you have to go through hoops, and that's not what families are needing from their employers. What they need is the autonomy to shift, to swap shifts, to control when they're working, to determine whether today is going to be a work from home day or tomorrow is going to be a work from home day, without having to go through hoops and permission cycles and that kind of thing. When we talk to employers, what can employers do? There are two different elements. There's direct supports and indirect supports. And the direct supports are things like paid days off. It's direct, it's cash, it's there. And indirect support would be things like providing an employee assistance program that includes a caregiving component, or lunch and learns, where instead of providing direct care for or direct support for their employees, it's indirect support, it's education, it's resource and referral. Increasingly, we're seeing networks being set up, or employee resource groups, ERGs, that are related to caregiving of adults, where the employer simply provides time or space or a few resources for people with caregiving responsibilities to get together during the workday, to share stories, to share resources, to support one another. Another indirect support is providing stress management tools or resources so that caregivers can focus on themselves as much as focusing on the person they're caring for. Resilience is a really important part of the caregiving and work conversation. And how do you build and enhance resiliency both from an employer and an employee's perspective? Your role as a caregiver and your role as an employee. So what we now know is that what workplaces that are successful at integrating individuals with multiple responsibilities is that they're shifting from what historically was the workplace norm, which is standard policies and programs, standard hours, standard work weeks, to where there might be some choice. So either you're a workplace that's traditional and have standards, or you're sort of in the middle where you're starting to offer choices. So you can remain a full-time employee, but you're going to, or you're going to be an employee, but you're going to go from a full-time or 100% workload to a reduced workload. And you have some choice around that. You have some choice around whether you stagger your hours. And then there's the third, more progressive organization that's looking at the customization of work policies, programs, procedures. So instead of having a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday schedule in the standard situation, or in the choice situation, you have an option to either do compressed work week or flexible hours or core hour attendance. That's the choice generation. Or the customization generation is you get your work done, you get it done how, where, and when works best for you, and we'll measure you on your output or your impact in the workplace. So those are sort of the 3 stages of development. Now, to keep sort of a frame, think coffee. Coffee used to be, particularly in the workplace, something that was offered that was hot, was black, was standard. And everybody's needs were met, and everybody's expectations were met, everybody was satisfied, it was there, it was available, done. Then comes along the 80s and 90s, and you have coffee in the workplace, and you have choices. Regular decaf, cream, milk, sugar, sweetener. That's the choice generation. That's sort of the choice workplace. And now we have tall vanilla latte, double hot, double shot, no foam, soy generation. And that's customization. But the core is still exactly the same. It's still a beverage. It's still made from a coffee bean. It's still picked and roasted. It's our experience with it that changes dramatically over time. And it's our relationship with, or our control over, how we combine the coffee, the water, the dairy, the sweetener, that changes the outcome. And if you're accustomed or need customization because of dietary or whatever, and your only option is standard, your needs aren't going to be met, you're not going to be satisfied, you're not going to be able to fulfill all of your responsibilities in the way that you need to. So I want to just sort of think about the way in which we combine caregiving and work. Before I close off, I just want to open up to questions. Any questions coming from our webinar participants, or any questions here? Tanya?
I do have one question so far from our webinar participant. Wondering, what if the nature of the work doesn't allow autonomy and flexibility, and that isn't something that the employer can easily provide? Are there other strategies?
When we talk about flexibility and autonomy, there are many jobs that make it impossible for you to flex your hours. For example, if you work at a hospital and you're working shift and you have to be there at 7 a.m. because that's when the shift changes. Or you're a truck driver and you have to be in the seat and you have to drive that truck from point A to point B. That's part of your job. Or you're in the agricultural business and you have to pick that fruit off that tree. You can't always do that remotely or from or postpone it, because when it's ripe you have to pick it. There is always a way to be flexible and or autonomous with even those kinds of jobs. But the examples I gave you were mostly for white-collar knowledge worker, small, medium, large-size businesses, where you might not be able to flex your time as a truck driver or a fruit picker, but you may be able to take some days off, or you may be able to have a different role for a while. So instead of picking, you were doing something else in the processing plant, or so shifting the kind of work that you do. Sometimes it means time off, but your job is protected. So we can't accommodate you on a day-to-day basis, and mom's going in for cancer treatment and you need every morning for the next 6 weeks. Then we need to come up with a different way of flexing. So it's not just around hours of work or place of work or work from home, but it's about a mindset. It's about imagining, in this situation, what can we do as an employer to accommodate multiple responsibilities? And there's always an answer, and it always comes from the particular workplace or the job or the component. It doesn't mean that you can just walk away and say, oh, well, we can't shift our hours, therefore we can't do any accommodation. There's always something. The question is how, where, and when. And the other piece to that is what resources are available in the community. So it might not be direct, I can let you come in later in the day, but I as an employer may be able to connect you with, or maybe in some cases even help to offset the cost of having somebody from the community fulfill that role and responsibility. Now, having said that, I did have an employer, a CEO, call me up one day and said, we've got a caregiving situation here at work. I have a senior person who's a top team lead. She's a critical part of the team. Her father's dying. His last wish is that she'd be there to hold his hand when he dies. I need you to send somebody over there so she can come back to work. Well, we had to have a bit of a conversation about that because that's not really an appropriate response at that particular time. But what we were able to do was to get her the support she needed so she could be off for a period of time, delay the project delivery date at the end with the customer, and we were able to sort of step back and look at the situation as being the realistic situation that was in front of us, as opposed to, trying to come up with these quick, fast solutions. If it worked over here, it's going to work over here, when in fact it might not. Yes, ma'am, we have a question from the audience.
Is there a place for employers to go to actually look at good practice? Is there a website or something?
Yeah, if you go to the VaniaInstitute.ca website, we have a couple of documents. One is a culmination of every kind of leave that there is in the country, who's using it, who's got it either in their collective agreement, in their policy manual, the language associated with it. And so you can see what other organizations are doing and how that's working and how it might apply. What's interesting about programs and policies is that tends to be available for mid-size or large organizations where there is an HR person, where there is an employee assistance program. Most of Canadians actually work in small workplaces or in family businesses or as an owner-operator, and that adds complexity. The other day I was in Prince Edward Island and walked past my favorite sushi shop, and I always go to when I'm in Charlottetown, and it had a sign, sorry, we're closed, we're providing care for a loved one. And so small businesses, the costs and consequences can be huge because now there's people that you're laying off, that you're not able to pay, there's customers that you could lose. I could go across the street to a different sushi place that could become my favorite, so there are costs and consequences for small and mid-sized businesses. And what we find is, and this is some of the research that was done at the Center for Families, Work and Wellbeing at Guelph when they studied small businesses and what were small businesses doing for caregiving. And basically they will accommodate each other. Yeah. They will, in most cases, find ways to adapt, to cover off, to support one another, because they themselves, as a small workplace, are a de facto fictive kin or family network, and so they will support one another in any way that they possibly can.
Is there research with that shows you get to retain your good talent because you have those policies? Because I want to try and convince other employers the upside of that.
So when you look at making a business case for employers, there's tons of data, and you can get it from the University of Alberta or from the Institute or from Guelph. The thing to remember when trying to convince somebody that this is an issue that they need to attend to, and that there are costs and consequences for an employer for either doing or not doing something related to family caregivers. Turnover, if the family is highly stressed, there are turnover issues. There's what we refer to as presenteeism, which is where people are physically present but emotionally, socially, intellectually elsewhere. So there are costs and consequences. But the best business case isn't going to get you very far if there isn't first some kind of emotional commitment to the issue. So you need to first capture their heart or their gut, and then be quick to give them what they need in their head. for the numbers and the data and the examples and the scenarios and the best practices or leading and promising practices. And then and only then will an employer be willing to open a wallet and invest time, energy, resources to resolving the situation. Now, we know that of the employers who are doing this, about 50% of those are doing it strategically, that want the policies, that want the data, and then we have another 50% roughly who are doing it on a one-off, case-by-case, almost like a favor or a situation one-off. So keep that in mind. Not everybody wants to be strategic, and sometimes you can have the best business case, and if they're not engaged in their heart or their gut, it doesn't matter what the numbers say. So we're running short on time. I just want to close off and leave you with the last thought that it's not the strongest species that shall survive, but that which has the greatest capacity to adapt. And we need to adapt in our households, in our healthcare system, in our community services, in our workplaces, in our professional organizations, in our labor unions, in order to recognize and respect that caregiving and work is here. It's here to stay, and that we are going to be dealing with this for a very long time in this country. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. I'd be happy to respond to them either after our meeting online. You'll have access to me through whatever comfortable means of communication fits your needs. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you, and thanks so much for CIRPD for having me here this morning. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you. Thank you so very much. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Tanya.
Wonderful.